Good afternoon. Broadcasting from Aboriginal Health here at Vancouver Coastal Health. We are on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. If you're joining us from anywhere within the Vancouver Coastal Health Service delivery area, then you are on the unceded homelands of one of the host nations, or you are on the traditional homelands of the Tla'amin Nation. My name is Ananta Harding. I'm Eastern Cherokee from Cherokee, North Carolina, and Irish and Italian. Up until very recently, I've been working as the coordinator for the Indigenous Cultural Safety Training at Aboriginal Health, and I am about to embark on my new journey as a parent, so this is my last webinar with everybody. I'm so excited to be joined by Mara Andrews today, Maori woman, researcher, business owner, leader extraordinaire. Mara, would you please introduce yourself?
Kia ora, hi everybody. Yes, as Anata said, my name is Mara Andrews. I'll try to speak clearly today so you can understand my New Zealand accent. I hail from 3 tribes in New Zealand. I'm a visitor here, living in the lovely Coast Salish territories. I've lived here for 9 years now and really loving it here. Just loving it. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So Mara, before we begin, to give a bit of context, can you give us a synopsis of your career to date? What have you done? Where have you worked? And what are you doing today?
I spent, when I left school, I spent a decade actually working for the Department of Maori Affairs in New Zealand, which is similar to Indian Affairs here in Canada. Worked in a lot of different departments there, so got to understand a lot of things, and then I moved into health in 1990, into the health system, thinking I don't know anything about health, but the guy who recruited me said, I don't need you to know about health, I need you to know about our people. We'll do the health, but we need our people on board. So I started there, so I've realised that I've now been in health systems for about 28 years.
Wow.
So feeling very old. I left there in the year 2000 and went consulting, and I've been consulting ever since. So yeah, 18 years now as a consultant, 8 years in New Zealand, and then I moved here in 2008. We still have our consulting work in New Zealand that carries on, and been working with in the field of First Nation and Aboriginal health here since 2008.
It's fantastic. Having a bit of an understanding now of the scope and the depth of your background in working for health authorities and also consulting for health authorities and Indigenous communities, agencies, and governments, I want to start unpacking our topic for today. So this is the 3rd session of the Indigenous Cultural Safety Spring 2018 webinar series, and the topic for today has been, what are organizations around the world doing to achieve more culturally appropriate care for Indigenous people? But in preparing for our conversation today, I've started to wonder if culturally appropriate is the right term. When I was selecting the topic for today, certainly I was thinking about Vancouver Coastal Health's commitment to engaging Indigenous service users better, achieving better experiences of healthcare for Indigenous people, and of course achieving better health outcomes for Indigenous people. And certainly there's the idea that culturally appropriate care will achieve those objectives. But I don't know if that's really the right descriptor of all the different things we could select. So based on your experience, should we be going for culturally appropriate to describe our topic, or is there something that would better describe what we're looking for?
I think just, moving around different settings, whether it's New Zealand or Australia or Canada or US, we're all dabbling in the language of cultural awareness, cultural safety, cultural competency, cultural appropriateness. Yeah. And we all use it in different contexts and in different ways. For me, I think about it as a starting point is simply awareness, that because you can be aware of other people's cultures but really not do anything about it.
Right.
And then you can, if you are in a position to do something about it, and you should do something about it, then people, I kind of see it as a continuum. You move to try and make things a bit more appropriate and culturally responsive, and you sort of go on this continuum to try and achieve competency. And I don't think you ever achieve it. I think it's a living thing.
Okay.
Because Indigenous people develop too, so you've got to, your competencies have to keep pace with where they're at as well.
Right.
So it's not something you can tick a box and say, I got my cultural competency certificate and now I'm done. You know, I think it's just a life learning thing. But I think what kind of underpins it all is really respect. That if you respect the person you're with or the family you're with, then, or even if you're in a role where you're dealing with other agencies, other managers, I'm going to respect this person's opinion and how they think and what their context is. And I think that's just the foundation for it all. If you start with respect, then what you do to try and tailor things and make things appropriate, make them culturally safe, etc., comes from that place.
Okay.
That I'm really respecting that you need me to kind of do things a little differently if I'm going to really help you. So I think if you start at that point, that's what really matters.
Okay.
So the terminology is not too, I'm not too hung up on it. I like seeing whichever terms people are using because they're taking action. That's what's really important for me.
Is the action.
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to invite you to share the story that you shared with me before about the meeting that you had and the elder who was at that meeting. Yeah.
I'm constantly reminded to take action. Don't just kind of be a bureaucrat or be a consultant and push paper. And my story is, and it goes back many years, in a health meeting. I was with a group of physicians and nurses and managers, and we had this strategy day, and we were discussing something, and we were talking for 5 hours. It was a long meeting, and back and forth, everybody had opinions about what we should be doing. And there was an elder sitting in the corner, and I was conscious he hadn't said anything all day, and I kept making eye contact, going, do you want to say something? And he'd be just like, okay. And so we did our thing, and we talked all day, and then right at the end, he said, I've only got one thing to say. While you people are talking, my people are dying. Mm-hmm. And I just felt so ashamed. I just thought, you're right. We're sitting here pretending we know the answers, trying to come up with the answers, trying to solve things for people, instead of going to the people he was talking about and saying, what should we do? And I think we need to be reminded to humble ourselves sometimes and remember we don't have all the answers. That the people who have the answers are the people we're trying to reach. Okay. And so he reminded me of that don't get caught up in the red tape and the bureaucracy. Remember, people are dying every day you waste doing your kind of bureaucracy thing. Okay. So it was a real powerful lesson.
Thank you. So perhaps for today, our topic can be, what are organizations doing around the world to provide respectful healthcare for Indigenous people rather than culturally appropriate? So I want to really draw on the experiences that you have and have that reflected in the topic.
I think there's some really good stuff happening here in Canada and around the world. I was not long ago reading a great guideline in Nova Scotia that had been written for physicians on cultural competency, and then another one coming out of Australia. And so people are producing resources and guidelines for health professionals all the time. Okay. But also there's good work being done, for instance, in Ontario. I had to have a meeting with some public health managers out there, and at the meeting was a person whose job title was equity and access. Okay. And I said, oh, so public health has an equity and access position? And they said, yeah, because part of our health surveillance role is looking at gaps and equity is a huge priority for the Ontario government, and so public health created an equity and access position. And that person's whole role is to work with every person in public health and make sure that equity lens is put on everything that they're doing and keep bringing people back to that place.
Okay.
So there are lots of good examples, both here in Canada and overseas, of people taking steps to take action, and not just look at the data and go, oh, isn't it terrible, the equity gap, but actually really trying to do something about it.
Okay. So then bringing respect with action, let's call this equitable healthcare. When I think about what organizations around the world are doing, I realize that my mind goes to mainstream organizations like Vancouver Coastal Health, colonial organizations that are not governed by the Indigenous people that they're serving. So I want to ask you, Maura, how much of the narrative around changes in healthcare for Indigenous people is focused on these mainstream organizations delivering the change?
In my view, just about almost all of it.
Okay.
The reality is for here in Canada, in New Zealand, and Australia, even in Hawaii, the majority of Indigenous people access care through mainstream or quasi-government health authorities. So if you're accessing most of your health care through there, then the system change has to come through there as well. Which isn't to say there aren't Indigenous services. It's just in those settings, they're the minority compared to the dominant, larger system. Unlike the US, as you know, which is majority Indigenous governed healthcare for the tribes. So most of the change needs to come out of the government kind of governed or established systems, because most of us are accessing our healthcare through them.
Okay. So then let's start there. What approaches or strategies have you seen these mainstream organizations putting into practice to achieve more equitable health care for Indigenous people?
I think they happen at all levels of these organisations. A health authority like VCH, which might exist in Australia or New Zealand or here, and they happen, right from government and governance right through to an individual worker on the front line. So one piece of work that is being done in New Zealand, for instance, is an attempt to try and make every health authority board reflective of its population. So if your district, your catchment area has 20% Māori population, then your board should have 20% Māori people on the board. So that the voices that are governing and speaking for healthcare for that population actually represent what that population looks like. So I think there's that whole issue of representation or reflection, I should say, like make your health authority reflect the population it's serving. If you're a health authority which is dealing with a large Asian population, then the majority of your reflection of your organisation should look like that. So that people are coming from that same mindset. So it goes right through to recruitment, and people are measuring where are our Indigenous staff, for instance. I know way back in 1990 when we started in New Zealand and we collect quite good workforce information, most of our Māori workforce were orderlies, kitchen staff, etc. They were working in the hospitals, etc., but kind of at those levels. And so we set really strong goals to say we want more surgeons, we want more nurses, we want more optometrists, etc. So, and I think a lot of great work has been done increasing that workforce. But it's got to be intentional, it's got to be something you really got to go for with that ultimate goal of saying we want our health authority to be reflective of the population it serves. But there are lots of other things, tools people are developing, much like the cultural guideline that VCH has now for working with Aboriginal people. There are apps now, there are things online, there are guidelines put out by medical councils, by professional bodies. There's lots of training available. There's lots of reading available. I mean, I think we're not short of actually information and ways to learn.
Okay.
And everybody's doing it.
Okay, everybody's doing it.
Everybody's doing it.
Okay.
You can go to New Zealand or Australia or Canada, and everybody's doing lots of different things. Yeah.
So these different kinds of initiatives that you're describing do produce better results for Indigenous people. Is that correct?
I think so. Certainly I've seen, I might have given you the example of Breast Screen Aotearoa, which is the New Zealand Breast Screening Agency, who really took a look at why Māori and Pacific Island women didn't have as good breast screening and cervical screening rates as the rest of the country. In fact, in some areas it was like half of what the rest of the country's rates were. So they were like, you know, what's the issue? We've been telling women you need to go get screened.
Right.
You know, it's all your fault kind of thing. And why aren't these women doing it? It was all the blame and shame type of approach. But once they did some engagement, they actually realised that women typically, or this group of women, they weren't prioritising themselves, you know, and a lot of women don't. They prioritise their family, their kids, their partners, and put themselves last. And so they really revamped their entire communications and advertising campaign, and all the people who were messaging in the campaign were their family. It was husbands, daughters, children, grandchildren saying, and the message was, do it for us. Go get screened for us.
Right.
Because we love you, we want you around forever, do it for us.
Right.
And, you know, they ran that campaign and the rates went up.
Right.
And the women got the message, and they had fun advertisements of a group of women piling into a bus and saying, we're all going to get our boobs screened today. But it made it less daunting and something, we want to do it for our kids, because our kids and our grandkids want us around. So I think if you're prepared to reorient how we typically do things, whether it's public health messaging or providing acute care or mental health, it's go to the people you're trying to serve and ask them for the answers.
Right.
Because the answers are there. They are absolutely there.
Okay.
We don't have all the answers. We're not the experts.
So these positive outcomes that you're seeing with, it sounds like more targeted initiatives, are they shifting the overall health statistics for Indigenous people, either in one of these countries or globally altogether?
Sadly, no.
Okay.
I actually think we're in a transition kind of period of generations. I think our current younger generation will be a healthier population, you know, in the next 20, 30 years. I think what we've still got today are all the inherited impacts of, you know, the last 100 and 200 years, depending on our colonial histories. But the sad fact is, across, you know, Native Hawaiians, Māori, Australian Aborigine, First Nations, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, we all experience much higher rates for things than anybody else. And that's across cancers, cardiac disease, mortality, suicide. Our rates are still much higher. So for me, there's just such a necessity for urgency to really get on top of that and try and stem that flow.
Right.
And I just don't think we act quick enough. You know, the trouble with our big health systems is they move slowly.
Right.
You know, they react slowly and move slowly because it's such a big system to move.
Right.
It's like a big beast, you know, that you're trying to turn on a dime. So it's difficult, but I think if you can make really intentional decisions and make them quick while people are dying and have that in the back of your mind that I need to move quick, I need to decide quick, I need to make hard decisions because we need to stem the flow.
Okay. Yeah. In your last year with the New Zealand Health Funding Authority, you were nominated for and granted a World Health Organization fellowship. What did you elect to investigate with those research monies?
Yes, I don't know how I got there, but I was very glad I did. At the time in New Zealand, our tribes in the 90s a lot of our tribes in New Zealand were settling historical treaty grievances with our government, and coming into quite large sums of compensation for historical grievances and, you know, illegal taking of land and suppressing our language and culture, etc. So many tribes in the 90s were moving into this new world of governing their own economic affairs and land affairs and cultural affairs. And so I was interested, working inside the health system, as to could they govern their own healthcare in New Zealand? Would that work here? And so I elected to go to the United States and Canada to look at self-governing models of tribes managing their own healthcare.
Okay.
Was it different? Did it work for them? And tried to find out what the results were. So I spent 9 months with about 24 different tribes in that area, just learning, listening.
In the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it was fabulous.
Wow.
Time. Yeah.
So what kinds of healthcare systems or programming did you observe these 24 different nations putting into practice?
I think the self-governing model in the US provides just so much flexibility for tribes to be very creative and really tailor what they're doing. They're not constrained to keeping things within budget lines and, you know, not being able to move money around, and being creative in the way they design their facilities, the way they welcome people, the way they hire, the way they deliver programs. I think that flexibility and not having all the strings attached,
right,
has allowed them to come up with some really amazing models of healthcare. And also what makes it is challenging for them, though, because it's like nothing like living next to the people you're serving.
Right.
You know, you're living in the community where everybody lives, and all the people you're serving live.
Right.
So you're seeing them every day in the supermarket, on the streets, and they're holding you accountable. And sometimes I think there's nothing harder than having to be accountable to your own people, because they expect a lot.
Yes.
They expect a lot from you. We elected you, we put you there to provide us with the best, and we expect the best. So I think it makes them more accountable for every dollar, for every service they deliver, because they know their people are watching.
Okay.
So I was very impressed with the system.
Were you also impressed with the health outcomes?
Yes, they were getting some very good results, and I recently read it might have been just last week. I've been fortunate to stay on all their mailing lists, and so I get a lot of the reports and submissions that they make to Congress. And the most recent one they made to Congress, their national advocacy body, was that they've managed to reduce diabetes-related complications by 40%.
Wow.
In the last 15
Wow.
years, just through their diabetes programming, and they're tracking it really, really well. So the positions that are working and advocating for continuance of this particular program are just seeing such good results. And that's just one amongst many, but it was one they were very proud to talk about to Congress. And,
absolutely.
And say our model's working.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Indian Health Service, who ran all the services prior to handing it off to the tribes, many times I've heard them publicly state the tribes do a better job than us.
Okay.
And so we are all for giving the authority over to the tribes to deliver their own healthcare, because they get better results than we do.
How would you characterize the relationship between the U.S. federal government and these different indigenous nations?
Well, it's interesting. The US is, you know, a very litigious country. Everything's based around the law and possibility of suing each other.
Right.
Just if you look the wrong way. But they really promote and respect that government-to-government trust relationship. Okay. And so the federal health agency, the Indian Health Service, is seen as an equal to the tribes. And the tribes will even go to Congress and lobby for the federal government agency to help fund the other tribes who aren't self-governing. So I think it's quite respectful. I think they've really, over the 30 or 40 years of self-governance, developed a real sophistication in their data collection, in their reporting, in their political advocacy, their ability to unite and come around, to get 550 tribes uniting around single issues.
That's impressive.
Is a major achievement. And it's just because of the regional and national and statewide infrastructure that has developed over the years. So I look at it and think, if you can unite over 550 tribes and get a single voice around particular issues like diabetes, it's incredibly powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In Canada, we hear this term often, government-to-government relationship. Having observed what you did in the U.S., how much would you say that Canada and other colonial governments, certainly the United States is one of those governments, how much have you observed them actually fostering government-to-government relationships with Indigenous nations?
I think just with some of the work that I've done across Canada, where I see the major opportunity for government-to-government relationships are in the treaty areas, where I think there is an expectation by the treaty nations that they have a government-to-government relationship with Canada. Much like New Zealand, I don't know that they would say that their partner is necessarily honouring the treaty in all its essence.
Okay.
We had one treaty in New Zealand and signed in 1840, and tribes still today are still pressing our government to honour what they promised in the treaty. So you can have a treaty agreement and you can have, the theory of a government-to-government relationship, but if you're not both fulfilling and bringing forward the commitments you made, then, is it really the relationship that you would expect?
Okay.
I think what I see here, especially through health transfer, is it's more of an administrative arrangement because it's still largely prescribed by federal government. It's very program based. You deliver this program within this program line.
Right.
And
that's
so
here in Canada.
Here in Canada,
okay.
Yeah. So I wouldn't call it, in terms of the funding arrangements, a government to government where the tribes are respected to have full flexibility for the resources they manage.
Right.
It's still largely program based and prescribed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, drawing on your experience from working around the world, from your research, and from what you've observed in the United States, what would you say are the most important conditions that need to be put in place in order for a system of healthcare to deliver excellent care and achieve excellent outcomes for Indigenous people?
Yeah, I've actually made this subject for a PhD.
Have you?
Is to look at what are the critical success
Okay.
factors that you need in place for an effective Indigenous-led system, but I think it's still just as applicable for any system. And it does contain things like having the right policy and legislative framework, that if you can tie things to legislative commitments or requirements, once it's built there, then you have something to sort of hook back to.
Right.
And then policy can flow from there, which reflects what's in legislation. But if you don't have anything there, it means you're constantly trying to negotiate your position, right?
Okay.
Because the government hasn't taken a position to legislate. So that policy legislation piece is really important. Communication with the tribes, with Indigenous peoples are really important, and having the mechanisms to do that. The US model for that is particularly sophisticated. How they communicate with those 550 tribes is pretty impressive.
Okay.
And the mechanisms that they use to get information out and to get it back to drive policy is really important. So communication is important. Also another area would be how you build in culture into that system and kind of embed it throughout, where it's not seen as added on, it's actually something that's just becomes the norm.
Right.
That it's just part of the way we do
integral.
things. Yes.
Yeah.
Accountability, how the system is accountable to Indigenous people, what that accountability looks like, not just in terms of producing annual reports or audit reports, but how accountable are you for the data that you collect and how you're using it, and how accountable are you for the decisions you make and the resources you manage. So at the end of the day, if you're in the system, as I was in New Zealand, I was constantly reminded that I'm managing this, New Zealand's national maternity budget, but I'm doing it on behalf of the public of New Zealand. This is their taxpayers' money.
Okay.
And so I owe it to them to spend it wisely and be prepared to stand up at any meeting and defend any decision that I made. So I think that accountability piece is also really important.
Okay. The questions then, and perhaps again, because these questions always come up, is how do we put those conditions in place, and whose job is it to achieve those conditions, to put them in place? Tell me about the International Indigenous Health Collaborative and how that began.
Yeah, it began because of that sense of urgency piece, and completely a little bit unexpected. And it started from a group of Indigenous health leaders from New Zealand, from Hawaii, and also from Alaska, had got together at a conference in 2014. And we had a side meeting and talked about, we started comparing rates on different things and saying, why is it that even though each of us has a different system structure, we have a different government, New Zealand doesn't have, two governments, we only have a single government, Australia, Canada, US had state and federal government. So we all have different government structures and different health systems, and yet the results are all the same for us as Indigenous people.
Right.
Why is that? And so the group got to the point of saying, you know what, we can't leave it to the systems anymore. We've got to start taking leadership ourselves and stop being kind of participants in it and start being leaders of it. And so from that, this group of people from these different countries decided to, we should form a Indigenous International Health Collaborative and start to formalise our relationship and start to share information on a more real-time basis.
Okay.
Because what we were finding is people go to conferences every 2 years or 4 years and bump into each other. You might see an amazing presentation here and there. And it's like we're waiting to see those things and find out the good work other people are doing. And I think where the group got to, certainly over the last 4 years, is all of us are doing amazing things, but we haven't got a simple way of sharing it.
Right.
We kind of have to wait for the next conference if somebody speaks about it. So we're looking currently at building a technology platform which will enable more real-time sharing of best practices and projects and research and different strategies people are using, so that we can share the information much quicker.
Right.
Especially if
one of the
people are getting
ways
good results.
that the members of the collaborative are collaborating.
Yes,
this
through the
information platform.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other ways will be through exchanges.
Okay.
We've agreed we should be exchanging staff and spending time shadowing one another in our various settings. And then the third is to actually have targeted symposia or working groups on particular issues.
Right.
The biggest issue for all of us right now is suicide. It's coming up as sort of at the top of the list for most of us as Indigenous people. And so rather than have a conference on 40 different topics in Indigenous health, it would be a targeted, smaller group. We would all bring our best minds together on the issue.
Right.
Not just kind of open it up to a big 400 people, but actually say we need to start bringing our best minds on these topics together to come up with solutions as Indigenous people.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very exciting where it's evolving to.
You had shared with me before that we as Indigenous people no longer want to be participants. We don't simply want to be consulted. We want to lead, and I hear you saying that again here. I want to play the devil's advocate for a moment and say, what's so important about leading as long as we're being consulted properly?
Mainly because you can consult, but it doesn't mean that you act.
Okay.
And that happens all the time, that people get consulted on different things, and those in the decision-making roles can kind of take from that what they want and
Right.
what fits, and other ideas might not fit. And so what you engaged about or consulted about may not necessarily turn into action.
Right.
So I think it's like the step down from actually leading, where you're actually at a decision-making position
Okay.
to drive things, rather than just being a voice in a process. You're actually making decisions. So
Okay.
it's about the power relationship, obviously. And when I was in the Health Funding Authority in New Zealand, we had what they call a funder provider system. So we held all the money and didn't provide any services. Our whole job was to hold the money and push it out to providers,
Okay.
whether they were hospitals or doctors or Indigenous providers. But you hold the power when you're holding the money.
Certainly.
And so it's kind of got to be on that side of the table to make the influence,
Okay.
rather than the other side.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of shifting the dialogue, shifting the relationships, what do you see the International Indigenous Health Collaborative doing over the next few years?
I think our focus is going to be on building and populating our sort of technology information sharing platform. There is something like it already in Australia, the Aboriginal InfoNet. They've been running that for 20 years.
Wow.
It's well supported by the Australian government, hugely successful. And so we don't need to start from scratch. We can learn from what Australia did, and it's a great information sharing tool. You can, people like me as consultants, I consult it all the time, because
Okay.
they often have some of the latest research, the latest government policies, strategies, projects, research. And so they have a team of people there. Their whole job is to be reaching out, finding out who's doing what,
Right.
and starting to populate, so that you can tap into that information really
Right.
quickly.
And you had shared, and I want you to touch on it very briefly, if you would. You had shared that also the International Indigenous Health Collaborative is preparing to speak at the UN as a representative of Indigenous health issues.
Yeah, I think with the recent, and I say recent because it was in the last 5 or 10 years, adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Interestingly, New Zealand, Canada and Australia were the last 3 countries to sign
Right.
on. You know, we didn't sign on when the rest signed on. We held off for a few years because I think our respective governments knew the impacts of signing on. But we did, all of us. And with that declaration commitment, it does mean somebody needs to be telling the UN whether, you know, that commitment's being brought to life,
Right.
at least through the healthcare. So the collaborative sees its role as being able to report to the UN on the declaration from people who are actually in the system, working in it, whether they're in the academic field or inside the system, like VCH,
Yeah.
Indigenous people, or whether they're Indigenous-led organisations, that let us report for ourselves rather than having our governments tell the story.
Right. The experiences that you have had over the last 28 years, your education, your research, drawing on all of that, I believe that we at Vancouver Coastal Health are very interested in your thoughts on how organizations such as Vancouver Coastal Health and even the departments or programs within such organizations can become effective partners with Indigenous people who are leading their own healthcare. What would you suggest?
Well, you know, I've been working quite closely with VCH since 2012, and in that time, the best examples I've seen of that true partnership is actually having people around the table really understanding and connecting. So, you know, some of the best meetings I've seen are local doctors sitting with a nation's health team and health management, and also VCH managers sitting all together at the table with a common interest of wanting to do good for that community. You just can't beat it. Like there's no letter you can write or paper you can write or website you can put up that will beat face-to-face relationship building.
Okay.
And literally that's what it takes. And I've seen it all over this region, some wonderful relationships between VCH staff and managers, really working hand in hand with community organisations and being a resource, being an ear, listening, learning, sharing, and really building that respect. I was surprised in the early days that some of the folks I helped facilitate these meetings for had never connected with First Nations or Aboriginal services in their life.
Okay.
And so they were like, are you going to take us into the reserve and are you going to be there? And they were really quite hesitant. But on the same front, the First Nation was also, are you going to be there when those doctors come? You know, because their fear is they're going to talk a language that they don't understand.
Right.
And so that kind of hesitancy to connect really surprised me. But, you know, as time's gone on, I've understood it, you know, the differences between that federal and provincial jurisdiction. I think it's just been awful. But, yeah, many VCH people are doing wonderful things. Or my recommendation would be is keep doing it, keep connecting. Don't just meet once and then say, that's it.
Right.
Like, keep connecting, visit, keep up to date with what services they're doing, what challenges they're facing. Take any opportunity personally in your own time to go to community events. They have a lot of public community events. And just really, you know, acknowledge that Indigenous people are a true part of the community, and you just get so much life out of Indigenous people, I find, you know. I mean, I'm biased because it's the world I live in and work in and I love, but it really does bring a new dimension to your life. I think that's a positive one.
Okay.
Whether it's in the professional setting or in the personal.
So it's a genuine relationship.
Yes.
It's a relationship that spans from your personal to your professional life.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been to a community, a First Nation or Aboriginal community yet, you know, to do business.
Yes.
Where they haven't said, you should come to our so-and-so event.
That's
or
right.
our powwow.
That's right.
Or we're having a community
It is
day.
our way.
They always invite. They're constantly inviting. So take those invitations.
Okay.
And take the family along, and because I think there's nothing like them seeing your face and saying, oh, you really do care about us.
Right.
You've come to us not with your work hat on,
right,
but you took your personal time, and they will just show you such hospitality and such respect. And that will spin off back into your work world.
Right.
Because they will trust you and
Right.
build that relationship with you, which will make your job better. So
wonderful.
but there are many good examples of it. Still lots more to be done. But
Thank you.
face-to-face is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. Mara, preparing for today has been so exciting for me, and I have to admit that the presumptions that I had about what it meant for an organization to be providing excellent care to Indigenous people, my presumption started to shift quite quickly when we started talking last week. And my thinking has shifted from how do we get them to do what we need to how do we create what we need. That kind of 180-degree change in thinking is so invigorating for me as a learner. And I appreciate it's the kind of change, that surprising sort of discovery that all of us as learners feel really energized to make. Thank you very much for your time in doing this with us, and thank you for your transformational work around the planet. I'm very grandiose when I talk about Mara.
Yeah, you are.
And thank you to everybody. This has been our third session with the Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Spring 2018 webinar series. We ran late, but I really wanted to. This is my last one, and Mara had so much to share. So thank you for sticking with us whenever you were able to. Please join us again next month, June 6th, same time, when we speak with Anishinaabe physician Dr. Michael Dumont on culturally integrative primary care. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.